So clinical research is how we advance science. This is how we learn. We come up with new drugs, new therapies. The way we know it works is by doing clinical research. And I encourage every single patient I take care of to discuss clinical research, find out their options, and enroll in clinical research if possible. So what is clinical research? So you can imagine a drug company or research scientist with an idea. The idea is that a certain molecule, certain drug will help either prevent or treat cancer. For them to prove it, they have to first test it in animals to see if it works, sometimes in petri dish. Then they have to treat in human beings. That's when clinical research, and specifically phase 1 clinical research, starts. One of the first questions we ask ourselves is this safe? What's the tolerability of the drug? And this is done in a very methodical way in a phase 1 clinical study. There are only several centers across the country that do this type of study because it requires intense monitoring of the patients. Doses are started at a very low dose and then escalated slowly over time on different patients. Once a dose is found to be toxic or tolerable, then that tolerable dose is taken to the phase 2. Phase 2 clinical study tries to understand what's the efficacy or what's the benefit of certain treatment, certain molecules, certain chemotherapy, or a combination. Phase 2 treatments enroll typically tens of patients, 40 or 50 at a time. And it compares the outcomes in a specific cancer of that particular regimen. It compares it to existing data of what we already know. If it's found to be helpful, beneficial, at least as much tolerated or better tolerated, or better outcomes, it controls cancer better, then it goes into phase 3 study. Phase 3 studies are what we hear about in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and that's what gets discussed on TV. This is where hundreds, maybe thousands of patients get enrolled throughout the country, maybe throughout the world, where they compare existing standard of care with the new regimen. And this is where patients might be randomized to getting the old standard of care or a placebo to the new treatment. And if it's found to be better than what we already were doing, then that becomes the new standard of care. And this is what is needed to get the drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration of the FDA in the United States. This is what we hear about in our newspapers, and this is when it becomes widely available to everyone to use as the new standard of care. There are also non-treatment clinical trials, and they're also important. There are some trials looking at finding the best screening test. For example, using low-dose CAT scan to find early lung cancer was a study that enrolled 50,000 patients across the country. And it found that with the low-dose CT compared to chest X-ray, we could save lives. Once it was demonstrated, that's when it becomes standard of care. There are clinical trials looking at prevention of cancer. For example, one of the largest clinical trials ongoing is looking at aspirin to prevent colon cancer or colon cancer recurrence. Patients who have undergone cancer treatment may want to ask their doctors about clinical trials for prevention of other cancers. There are clinical trials looking at studying a population of individuals to identify risk factors for developing cancer in a human being. You might want to ask your local cancer center to see if there are any clinical trials looking at healthy volunteers, those people who do not have cancer diagnosis, to understand what their habits are, what their lifestyle is, to see if it is a risk factor for developing cancer in a later time. This is a long-term commitment, but many times those cancer studies can help us understand how do we prevent cancer as a society.